Living in the diaspora presents unique challenges for individuals, especially married couples, and navigating these transitions successfully can help to strengthen family relationships. In this podcast, we hope to provide women relocating to a different country with a direct and unfiltered perspective on how they can be empowered to proactively move to a foreign country with their spouses if and when the need arises in this 21st century. Welcome to the Help We Need podcast, where we explore topics that empower women and support their well-being. I'm your host, Fumike Moronkeji, and on today's episode, we will be providing support from a counseling perspective to help women who have relocated or contemplating moving to a different country other than their original home country or current place of residence. On our episode for today, we aim to tackle the myths surrounding relocation and help single women or married women or women in relationships understand what they need to be mindful of to ensure their marriage remains healthy and it's not negatively impacted. Our special guest is Dr. Taiwo Adeomi. Dr. Taiwo Adeomi is a practicing child and adolescent psychiatrist with over 2 decades of experience working in the United Kingdom. Dr. Taiwo provides counseling for married couples and their families as part of a general and faith-based support process, and he is currently based in Dubai. Welcome, Dr. Taiwo. Thank you for joining us today to talk about this very pressing issue and, evolving topic of addressing concerns that arise for women and couples as a result of immigrating to a foreign country.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here on the podcast there.
Absolutely, and thank you too for obliging us and joining our podcast today. I'm deeply honored as well to have you with us. Okay, so first I would like for you to tell us a bit about yourself and why you decided on exploring the medical specialty psychiatry.
I grew up in Nigeria, and I recall as a child, I had significant family members who had significant challenge in mental health and severe illnesses like schizophrenia and other severe things. So it was something I was always mindful of. I just grew around it, and it was just normal because it was all around me. I had aunties, uncles, cousins, at different times, people presenting what looked like. We had a lot of epiphanics and people, on my way to school, people who lived on the streets. And so it was just something you just saw it as a part of life. But especially when it came very close, I began to observe that very closely and saw the impact of mental health disorders on people, and sometimes how it could affect them so significantly that the downward trend. Some people cope with it, some people their life completely spirals and they can't look after themselves. So when I was interested in and I was interested in doing medicine, so the other aspect of it also was I go to church a lot when I was growing up, and I was in a church where there was a lot of spiritual emphasis and a lot of prophetic and supernatural stuff. And I was always mindful that a lot of mental health issues was seen as spiritual and something you have to pray and do, different, either through church or mosque or even traditional. I saw all of that. So for me, when I got to medical school, and I was interested in them, I was curious about it. So when I got into medical school, and then I realized, did my first psychiatric posting, it kind of really brought it to 40 minutes. I'm thinking, this was a lot of things that I used to see growing up. And to then realize that actually there are some understanding and things that could help, things that could make the difference, and that all of them are not necessarily spiritual as we put it, but that are actually practical wisdom and guidance that can actually make the difference for people's life. And so for me, that was really where my curiosity grew, and then I just gave myself to it. And I enjoy, I enjoy speaking. I enjoy the aspects of coming alongside people, getting to understand what's going on for them. But just knowing that practical wisdom and insight can make a huge difference to people's emotional, physical, mental, spiritual health, for me, was a real eye opener, and something that, and then to realize I can still combine that with my passion in medicine by doing something like child psychiatry. For example, in child and adolescent psychiatry, you're constantly talking about systems. So you're not just collocating the problem in the child. So you see two children with exactly the same symptoms and the same problems, but living in two different environments. And you see one of them have a positive trajectory and can cope and can get better and do well. And another one completely, becomes dysfunctional, not just because of the problem the child has, but also because of the system in which that child is operating. So just this very small two layers for me was really, really helpful, and being able to go there and influence and affect and bring wisdom and insight. Yeah, for me, really, that was where my interest in psychiatry and then subsequent practice in child and adolescent psychiatry and intellectual disability and working with systems. And as part of working with systems, then you've got to deal with families, you've got to deal with couples, you've got to deal. So that whole systemic outlook and how systems actually can have a direct or indirect impact on health one way or the other was part of the things that have really endeared me to, this practice. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's a very beautiful, I don't want to say story, but that's what it is to me, that you've shared in terms of how you've observed your environment, and your curiosity has led you further into the medical specialty of psychiatry. And just also, I love the word you used around systemic, because we don't live in isolation, right? And these things are, use or control or impact the way we behave. So yeah, it sounds very, very interesting. But thank you for sharing your story, and I hope our listeners obviously have enjoyed how you walked us through connecting the dots as well. So maybe they are now they've now encountered a situation where maybe their spouses or partners, because of the stress, I don't know, whatever it is, have now become physically abusive. They feel like this was not the man I moved with, or this was not the man I went to meet in the hopes of a new livelihood or just a new future, and things have just gone far. How would you, or what would you suggest to women to protect themselves, if you allow me to put it in that way, that are faced with this dilemma?
Yeah, I think it's no, that's a really helpful scenario you are painting, and unfortunately, life does happen, and a lot of people relocate with a lot of expectation and hope that things will get better, but sometimes, unfortunately, either due to some decisions making, or sometimes completely due to no fault of theirs, but just just the fact that things don't line up the way they want, and then stress can start to happen, or things might not go as well, and then you suddenly then find, particularly because you're referring to like sort of couple and relationships specifically, and then maybe sometimes if things don't go well, then you kind of find that people start to react very differently, and sometimes people might struggle, but particularly now, because we're talking about women here, where the men are now becoming quite different, and the relationship is becoming quite strained. And particularly, like you said, if you now get into a situation where there are concerns about threat and safety up to the life of the women involved, I think it's always good to realize that we need to keep yourself safe in order to try and resolve and to be able to make good any situation. The last thing you want is to find yourself in a situation where you put yourself in mortal danger, because if you're in mortal danger and something terrible happens to you, you have no way to remedy or to way to make anything right. So we're always very clear that if there is any sense of immediate danger, or you feel that your life is at risk or your life is a threat, then you really need to reach out and call for help. And in most countries will have different agencies or different setup depending on where you are in the world. But there is a recognition within most sort of social agencies or family support systems where you always prioritize the safety and the integrity of the person involved, irrespective of what's going on. And if it means getting out of that situation immediately, then it's better to get out of that situation immediately, ensure your safety. And then from that safe place, you can actually then explore. Now, sometimes we think, sometimes in our culture, you think, oh, getting out means, I'm abandoning my relationship, or that means my marriage is no longer working, or that does not translate into divorce or saying you're having nothing to do with them, or no. It's more about your integral safety. And again, I remind people again, going back to our culture, if a man was abusive to his wife, the parents' family will come and take their daughter and go back to your parental. And then they call a family meeting and say, you cannot be putting your hand on our daughter, and you have to give us, assurances that this is not going to happen again. None of them will say, stay there and put yourself in a threat, because we don't want to. If they see you come, like say you go to your parents and they see you black eye and blue, no parent will say go back into the house. But people, we've had instances where maybe even the wife's family go back and maybe try and attack. I'm not encouraging people to, but sometimes that's how bad people can become really aggrieved by this. So as a culture, we do recognize there's a place for safety and there's a place we need to keep you safe. But because we're now in a different country, again, goes back to my point, there are also within these different countries the same level of safeguard and the same level of saying, look, your self-preservation and integrity is critical and is primary. And depending on, so again, having some understanding of what is the legislation around where you live and what are the kind of support system that is there. And in an abusive situation, at worst, you can almost call emergency service if you have no idea. But having some understanding about what's actually available and what key support groups are there would be a really important things to know about it. So, for example, I can speak, for example, like the UK where I live very well. You've got social service, you've got family support teams, you've got like refuge centers where if a woman feels stranded, you can make a call and you will get a place where you can go. You've even got the police who can come and take you to a place of safety or remove the threat in the place so that they cause a physical separation between both of you and then give everybody time to reflect. It's not making a judgment or saying this is wrong or right. Or no, the important thing is keep you safe. And then once you're in a place of safety, then you then have time to then reflect about, okay, what has happened? How have we come to this point? And based on how we've come to that point, are there remedies and things we can do to try and make things work? And take practical steps to do that in a healthy and in a safe way. But please, for no reason should you compromise safety more than anything else. But once that safety is there. But sometimes it might not even be at that level yet. It might just be at the level that things are beginning to happen. And that's the point where, again, if you're still at a stage where you feel there's an opportunity to communicate openly and chat and talk about these things in a safe and appropriate way, and you feel that there's still enough integrity within your relationship to be able to do that, then take advantage of that and don't just hide away and let things fester and grow. Deal with it as quickly as possible. Or if you get to a point where you're feeling, I'm beginning to get worried here, but if you have meaningful relationships or mentors or people that you can speak into those situations and who are support for you, then those might be the point to quickly bring those in and take it. But you want to nip things in the bud as quickly as possible before they really escalate to really dangerous levels. And again, there are also statutory statutory bodies that are there that can support you if you've gone to that level. And there are also opportunity again for counseling and going for marriage counseling or couple therapy and things like that. So again, it's about quickly recognizing the stages. But please, if you see things happening, please try and reach out in good time. I know sometimes people feel like, oh, I don't want to bring my issues out, or I don't want people to know my business, or I don't want to see I'm failing. But then I say to myself, actually, the reality is you're failing. So again, acknowledging that, appraising that, and then actually taking a step to salvage that is a much more honorable thing to do than just put your head in the air and hope everything gets better. I don't know if that's helpful just to look at.
I mean, we're talking about abusive situations here, right? Where I like the word you've used, the realities are failing. So an abusive situation would definitely be physical abuse, right? Beating, banging, black eye, those things that threaten your well-being. And you've used the word safety over and over and over again. So I think it's just helpful to put things in perspective to say if it has not degraded, your relationship has not degraded to the point where there's physical abuse or it's not so intense, then maybe we can have a conversation about it. What I hear you say. Try and sit down and figure out why are we doing this? What could we do differently? But as the stages evolve, which hopefully we hope it doesn't, you're able to nip it in the bud. But if it's getting really bad, because again, like you rightly pointed out, the support systems are not there anymore. Family is way back home. This is a new environment. Things are tough. Situation is dire. I think it's helpful for women if we're going through this situation and we're on the call, and it's just very typical, Dr. Taiwo, women to be quiet. Because as a woman, at least I can speak hopefully for the number of women listening in. We want to put things under control. You know, we want to try and manage the situation. But in this scenario, if there is physical abuse, I think managing the situation can be counterproductive. And the word I hear you say is please speak up. If you don't act quickly, this could, God forbid, mean loss of life or more serious situations. And I think more importantly, when children are involved, I mean, the stake is high, but the stakes are even higher. And we as women need to understand that it's in our own interest to ensure that we stay safe and we're safe in such situations. Understand what works in the locality or the area you're in. And you're not alone. It might seem as if you're in a new location, but there are things that they put in place to make sure that women are cared for, children are cared for, or just the citizenry are well taken care of. So I would encourage women, in addition to all that you've said, to not keep it in till it goes out of control. There is support wherever you are. Please take support. Call a trusted friend. Talk to somebody. I mean, that way it's easy to navigate. So thank you so much for providing that perspective in terms of what our women should be doing.
If I can just underline that again, just to understand that in many of these cultures and organizations, there is an understanding about the help and the support that women need in those situations. People have a lot of understanding about how these dynamics work and how these things can escalate. And by the time it's getting to that situation where you're feeling threatened, they know that a lot has already happened, and they understand that importance of maintaining your integrity, not because they want to break your home or anything, but because they know there is a value in keeping you safe. And then from a safe space, you then have the mental capacity, the clarity of mind, and the competence to then explore what the situation is. It actually puts you in a better situation to explore. And if your goal is to restore your home, then you can come at it in a way that is safe, in a way that is meaningful, and the right support. So it doesn't mean that by taking that action you're denigrating or kind of turning back on your vows or kind of doing something that is not wholesome. Actually, it's a courageous move to say, actually, I value my relationship so much that I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to make sure that this does not completely denigrate or end up in a really bad situation, that actually we can do something about it. And of course, it takes two to tango, but at least you've done your bit. And then it then depends on your engagement from your spouse and what they're willing to do. But at least you've done what you can do to try and salvage that. And you cannot take responsibility for other people's action. You can only take responsibility for your own action. So you need to take an action that will keep the safety for you and your children. And the other partner has to own their responsibilities for their action. And we have to be careful, because sometimes that's the sort of guilt or projection of guilt that, why did you do that? Or you're trying to break the home. No, you can only take responsibility for your actions. The other partner also has to take responsibilities for their actions.
Yeah. well. Wonderful. Thank you for, adding on to that. I think it's really helpful that women, if they get to that situation, see it as the ability to be courageous, to be able to take control in a way that they are taking responsibility for their actions. They can't control the other party. So I guess that was a bit of intense in terms of what could happen if a relationship breaks down. But maybe taking a step back a bit and looking at it from a situation where it's getting to that spot where you feel like your relationship with your spouse or partner is deteriorating. So it hasn't really gone in that bad. So my question around this scenario is when women, are having a difficult spouse and obviously they know the conversations are not helping and things are not really going as smooth as it ought to, and they've suggested therapy, but the spouse is not willing to go that route or explore that opportunity of let's have therapy, let's get somebody who's a professional to help us through this rough patch in our marriage, for example. What should a woman in this situation, what should she do? The spouse has said no to therapy, nothing is working. How should she go around this?
Yeah, I think that can be a bit challenging, but I think we're talking in the context now where there are just sort of difficulties in the dynamics of relationship. This is not an abusive situation or anything. It's just the fact that the relationship is not working as well as it could. And it could be various type of reasons and everything like that. I think as a woman's spouse there who is beginning to notice that, I think I remember a quote from somebody who says, again, it's not always about wanting to change the other person, but sometimes, change me to change my partner, just as part of a general. And sometimes when I'm speaking to couples, and I say sometimes the fact that you have the insight to understand that this relationship is not going well and the other person doesn't see it, that in itself is putting you at least at a cognitive advantage, because you are seeing what the other person is not seeing. The other person are not seeing their blind spots, but you are able to see that, you're noticing that. So again, it's not necessary to see that and then to kind of use it to beat up the other person. It might actually be that when you are getting the insight and you happen to be the person who is leading the way, then that could make you ask yourself, okay, actually, what is going on here? Why are we beginning to go off these things? That could give you an opportunity for some reflection and introspection for yourself. And there are practical things that you can do to begin to shape that. Because oftentimes it takes two to tango. And sometimes one person has to step back or take the lead in reconciliating and making that move, not because you're stupid or because you're getting, but because you're fighting for a greater good. Sometimes sometimes I say to families, I say, you don't want to win the war and lose the battle, as it were. So sometimes you can see maybe something is causing a bit of a bother, but actually in the bigger scheme of things, it's not such a big deal. And if kind of giving into that or allowing some room in that, so that at least you can get a bigger, in working between you and get a better understanding, you might be able to say, okay, in that way I'll just give in there in order to kind of just smooth things over, but knowing that there are other bigger and more important things. So of course you understand your red lines, but some things are not necessarily as big as they are. And if you realize, okay, this is not such a big deal, and if it's causing so much stress, okay, I'm happy to do that in order to make sure I do that. So if you have the insights and understanding, then take time to do that. And sometimes even getting a therapy for yourself in terms of actually helping you to make sense of where you are in that relationship, get a clarity in terms of your role and what are you bringing into this table. Because oftentimes there's always, more than one side to a story. Not necessarily that you're taking blame for what you're not supposed to be taking blame for, but actually, if this is not functioning, am I making a good appraisal of it? Do I have a real understanding of what's happening? Do I have the clarity of mind about what needs to happen and all of that? And sometimes even just all that work on your own can give you a bit of clarity, can give you a bit of help. And then are there practical things you can do in just kind of, is your husband going to stress, or is the work just very difficult? Are there things you can do? So things like revisiting your core values. Can you draw into your foundation and what makes your relationship works? What does things that please the person? So again, this is about sometimes in relationship, we always have to realize that one person might be strong, the other person might be weak. And sometimes one person has to stand up and almost like carry a bit of a burden. And then when things get better, and then in other situations, the other person might be like that. So if it's still at that level, sometimes you can rise up and take a bit more, take a bit more weight and feed in to kind of turn things around. And then, in reflection, when things get better, he will look back and be really grateful and realize that, oh, I was slacking a bit there, but the way you stepped in and the way you responded so positively and so helpfully. And if you need to get some for yourself to help you, there's nothing wrong, because even in therapy, sometimes you have to do work individually with the couples and then work that you do with them together. So some of those individual work, you can start to do that yourself. And like I said to people, any self-exploration and things you gain, you can never lose that. That's for you. Even God forbid that the relationship falls away or whatever good you've done for yourself or ways you've tried to, sort of develop yourself, that's yours. Nobody can take that away from you. So you will never lose that anyway. But if that can then contribute to actually helping your relationship, then even better. So again, those are things you can start to think of and at least begin to do that as a way, and then might be again exploring what is it about counseling, and maybe what type of counseling or who is doing the counseling. Is that in a professional setting? Is that in a faith-based? Is that a community? Is that a good friend who can be impartial and who can be objective? So sometimes you may need to be a bit flexible, and like I said, sometimes you may need to use an informal route before you come to a formal setting, but it all depends on what you're trying to explore. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. I like the word you used around reflect, because I think sometimes it's always the first port of call, but we make it the last call. Because as women, we're emotional, right? We thrive on emotions. We're able to read between the lines, and we're just emotional creatures, right? That's why we should be treated, in a special way. I was speaking for myself, but more generally for women. But more importantly, it's, are we reflecting? Are we understanding what the real issues are? Or we're just dancing around the point and just being unnecessarily like a kettle, flying off the burner? Are we really sure that what is causing us to make so much noise is worth it to start? But I like the part where you talked about get therapy for yourself. Because this is a question around the man is refusing to get therapy because he feels therapy is intrusive. I don't want to, put out my dirty laundry in front of somebody that hardly knows us. And then I start talking about intimate things. And, that's a valid point in itself. But more importantly, getting to resolve, we could start with ourselves. And getting the therapy, I guess, opens up more perspective, and maybe from there things could resolve, and maybe that's a problem. I mean, you never know. And just having somebody counsel, you as a woman to start with, I think it's a better way to approach the situation. And then if things don't really get to that part where it seems as if it should, then you get further guidance as to how to navigate. So maybe talking to a close family person. You talked about informal counseling the other time when we started off, somebody this person respects. Maybe that could be an opening to get, the conversations going. But one thing I also picked from what you said is when we do the solo counseling, it's self-developing, right? So we're not losing either way. We need to evolve from there, it's for our own good. And if we need to take things further, at the end of the day, it's a win-win situation. So thank you for putting that in perspective. I think in my next line of maybe reasoning or questioning, I'm just wondering, for some of us women, when we relocate to a different country, it appears we've been overly dependent. And maybe I could speak for housewives, or in this case, we call them homemakers, right? So we've been so dependent on our spouses. And now that we've moved to a new location, like you said, it's a different environment. The dynamics are different. The socioeconomic factors are different. And maybe the husband is not doing so well in terms of bringing in, finances. And there needs to be some further help to bring finances or support the family. But in this example, is more around if the wife broaches the subject, it seems as if the husband is losing control. I mean, it doesn't say that, but it may get a bit of into that uncomfortable zone, and the wife knows it. If I bring up this topic, he doesn't want me to work. But now the stakes are high. I need to work. So in that situation, how would you advise women to navigate this very sensitive space where they need to hone the conversation in sort of encouraging or assuring their spouses that me working is not you losing me? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that can be tricky, and but also importantly is trying to understand what is, if what actually is the difficulty for, let's say, for the man now specifically. Is it a situation where is it a cultural barrier? Is it a passional barrier? Because depending on what is driving that, it can make it easy to navigate, or it can make it very, very difficult to navigate. In certain cultures where you think, no, the role of the woman is to be at home, it's a no negotiation. The husband is the one who goes out and makes money, and the woman stays. And that's cultural or religious or whatever. It's kind of set in stone. Then it becomes a lot more trickier, and you will need a lot of navigation and bringing in a lot of wisdom from the community and the understanding, especially both of them sign up to that. And for some people, that may mean it's not possible, or you may have to look at something or a different way to kind of try and make that happen. But sometimes if it's things around, sometimes the guy's personality or the guy's own complexities or feel threatening or in terms of his cultural role and all of that, then there is scope to be able to look at that. So it's important for the woman, when you want to approach this, to at least try and have a good appreciation of what is a problem for your husband. Because if you get the good appreciation of where the difficulty for him is, then you can then try and find an understanding that fits in, that speaks to what the difficulty he's having is, which is slightly different from a situation where it's just that the guy just wants to be maybe controlling or abusive or put the woman down and all of that, because then that's slightly different. So if it's coming from a guy who is genuinely, this is something they agree, to them sees it as something positive and almost sees it as if he's failing in his role, because now he's putting the wife in a position where she has to go and do work where they're not supposed to do that. Then again, being very upfront about that and doing that in a really empathic and a really supporting way, and acknowledging why it might be a struggle for the guy, and therefore even for the woman. And if you want to approach that, you will find a way to communicate that, to help them realizing that you're not negating what are your core values, but within that core values, you're looking for how is it that I can complement you and I can be a blessing to you. And that might mean that even, for example, when you're looking at what kind of things will you do, that might impact the kind of thing. So it may be that you may not be able to go into full-time employment and be gone all of the time, but it may be like maybe more like a part-time working or online working or things like that. So it still doesn't mean you can't do things, but again, it just means that you may need, even as a woman, if you've both signed up to the same value system, you just can't jettison that because you're now in a financial situation. That will be rocking the foundation of your life. So you've got to be pragmatic about it, except you want to rupture that completely. But even within that, you may be able to find what is it that still fits in with your core value that you can bring in, that is no longer as threatening then to the guy, but sees it as, no, this is actually something that helps us to continue to be who we are. It's not like, oh, now we're abroad and now we've destroyed who we are, integrity of our home or our culture or our religious beliefs and everything. So it's always good to share that unity, and you've always shared it and to work within that. But secondly, again, outside of those spaces, again, trying to be open in terms of the conversations and come across in a way to, I know sometimes it's not easy when these things are emotive, but to try and find a way in which you can actually, make it not look like you're failing or you're not bringing up, you're not doing this, or I've got to go and look for work, and, almost that sort of a, say it as a partnership. We're working together. And part of the reality also, again, it goes back again to that understanding of sometimes when you're away from Nigeria and you're now here, and let's say, for example, you're living in the West where it might not be as easy to depend on one income and realize actually there are more than a lot of people do two income families, but some of it might be maybe part-time rather than full-time. And like I said, there are different ways you look, or what kind of jobs can you do that does not really fracture the fundamentals of what you think you are and the core you are. So you have that. And then again, before you do anything as well, check with your local regulations, what's your work permit? Are you doing things that is not contrary to what you should be doing or jeopardize your residency or your stay and things? So make sure you're staying within the legal framework. And if you have existing skills and things you can do already, that you can then begin to do that and be maybe something a bit more that you have control and leveraging skills and things like that. I know people who will do like tutoring or do online work or do a bit of like somebody who's got an accounting who will support somebody, and so again, just be a bit more creative. But I think for me the most important thing is that you want to do it in that context of the unity, and you want to keep the values of what is important for you as a family at the heart of it. Whereas if it suddenly becomes like, I just want to tear that apart and I'm not interested, that can cause a lot of it. But if you comment that, then hopefully if you have a husband who is understanding and loving, then that's fine. Now, if it comes to the point where it's just really negative and the guy doesn't want it, then that's coming into now a realm in which you have to talk about dysfunctional family settings, and you have to see that in a completely different light. And of course, in that context where it's very clear that this guy is doing things deliberately to dehumanize you or to do things, then you need, then you've got to do what you need to do. But then in that case, you're in a different space, and how you work and negotiate that will be very different from when you're actually together in partnership, or you just need to sort things out a little bit. And again, another aspect of it is, even smart budgeting, depending on how the budget of the house runs and how much incomes comes, what are the savings. You can be doing your own savings and making some little income, your savings, and depending on how much is coming through. Yeah, so it can be a bit complicated, but I think if we keep the principles of what is important for you as a couple and what is actually driving it, if it's been driven by genuine pressures and needs, then I often find that in my experience it's easier to walk around it. But if it's become dysfunctional, or maybe we're talking of a narcissistic, or we're talking of something, not really helpful or wholesome, then that brings you into a different territory. And you might need to walk through that a bit more carefully and think through that, because then we're almost coming into like an abusive situation rather than a healthy relationship. And then we go back again to some of those primary things about what is safe, what so the threshold is very different from how you will approach that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you. This is really helpful because you broadened it out, because scenarios are different, right? Every case is different. And what would be presenting to a particular woman would definitely be presenting differently to another woman in the context of this fear. I think the word is the fear to broach the subject around working with my spouse, who we've already had an understanding that I will not work. He is the sole provider for the family. But again, the understanding, and I think I like the word you used previously. You talked about you have the cognition. You are thinking clearly, and the other person is still sitting within the blind spot zone. And you have that foresight, that insight. This amount you're making cannot sustain all. And you're coming from that level. I think what probably might be helpful is to seek guidance from a trusted person. And again, we're talking in the context of counseling. We're talking in the context of therapy. If it's becoming or presenting itself as an issue, it probably is an issue. But getting the right advice before taking the decision, I think, would always be the best way forward. So whatever circumstances the women on our podcast are, you're able to navigate it in a pragmatic way, just like you've said, and in a way that you don't completely tilt the boat and just ruffle everything and mess everything up. So it comes with wisdom and understanding where the sweet spots are, and also doing our homework as women. In the country where you are, can you work? Is it legally permissible? I mean, even before you broach the subject, check, right? Because if you can't work, there's no point bringing up the subject. So we understanding what the issues are before we even start the conversation. And you rightly said, we're in the 21st century. Women don't physically have to go out and work. You could do remote working. You could do part-time jobs so that the man understands that this is a partnership. And again, I think it's also the way we talk. Because sometimes it could come across as, I don't know, depending on how the man is seeing it, we're imposing or we are, making them look like they're not competent. So I think it's just some further guidance because everybody's situation is different. And I believe based on the helpful tips that you and the insights you provided, our women, they can balance their independence with collaboration, right? Because we need to work together as a team and foster a healthier and more equitable partnership with their spouses. So thank you. That's really helpful. You've shared examples while we talked, right? So this has been very helpful to further buttress the point as you've explained, and tried to provide perspective for all the questions we've asked so far. So I want to thank you for that. In this particular question is me now asking you, if you can, to share with us a particular example or a real life scenario where you've been able to help a couple, maybe manage their internal rivalry, and come to a place where the problem has been resolved, so that our women on the call can see counseling as something that is really helpful, right? And it's maybe a line of option that they can explore.
Yeah, no, I've had quite different scenarios, and like I've tried to throw some of them in as we've talked, just to kind of give some general principles and things like that. But I think I find sometimes with couples, when things get emotive, sometimes it's very hard to communicate or to communicate clearly, or sometimes the communication get lost in the emotiveness of the issue. So you kind of find that you did something I wasn't happy with and I wanted to talk about it, but then we all got emotive and then we started accusing each other, and then it blew over, and then we come back later and then it's like we never talk about it. And then one partner, maybe the woman in this case, feels I never really get my issues addressed, because once I start, it gets defensive. We then both get defensive and upset, and then we kind of just drift apart, and we never get that done. And then, of course, then that builds in, and then the husband comes back and says, I thought we've talked about this. Why are you not going to bring in this up again? But in the woman's mind, it's like, no, we never, because when I brought it up, you just got angry and upset and blew everything over, and then I had to back down just to keep the calm. But my real issue was never felt to be addressed because of the way you came in. And sometimes with things like that, I find that having an opportunity to facilitate a conversation can be really helpful. Because in that situation, what is happening is they're trying to communicate, but they're not really communicating the real issues, because the emotiveness and the defensiveness gets in the way, and suddenly they're dead in the lock. And then in this particular case, the husband is like, what's the point talking to you? We just keep going around in circles. We resolve something, but you keep going back to it, so I'm not doing. And and sometimes we use what we call like reflective practice, where sometimes I get them into a session and I'm like, life is going to speak and you're going to be quiet and just listen. It doesn't matter whether you agree with what she's saying or what or not, or whether you think, oh, that's completely wrong, you got the wrong. No. You're going to have a session where all you're going to do is like yourself and your wife will be talking, and you're just going to listen. And you're not allowed to interrupt, you're not allowed to correct. Yeah, I understand it's a perspective. You will get the opportunity to come back and correct it. But suddenly it gives the woman the opportunity to actually say what she wanted to say, the point she wanted to get to, without them getting into that thing. And then you have that opportunity where you just spend, and sometimes depending on how serious it is, it could be 1, 2, 3 sessions where she's that had the opportunity to talk through all of that. And then he can now listen and hopefully slightly disengage, and so that he's not focused on, I want to correct you or I want to challenge you. No, he has to genuinely listen and try and see it from where she's coming. And sometimes that can be really helpful and insightful, because suddenly then he realizes, oh, okay, because she never got to where she was going because I've already jumped in and then I picked the wrong head, and then she gets annoyed. So this is where you, and oftentimes you realize that actually the issues are really not as big deal as they are, or sometimes they might think they're on a different page completely, but they're actually not. So that's an example where I found out using that reflective practice. And then you do the opposite way, where the wife just listens to the husband. There's no interruption, there's nothing, and whatever how long session it might take, sometimes one session, sometimes 2 or 3 sessions. And that's hard because people kind of want to jump in, and that active listening is a real art and something to develop that is really helpful. And then once you go through that, and each of them have noted it, then you then have a joint session where we then come back now and kind of try to say, okay, do you understand that? Can you bring a different perspective? And then we'll layer it and hopefully then try and resolve it. But then they can then take a way out of that session where you then begin to learn to have conversations where you're not jumping and interrupting so much. So you can get to the heart of what the issues are, so that hopefully the conversations are much more resolving and much more helpful and awesome, and everybody has a sense of being heard and being understood and understanding the other person's perspective, and then they can grow together and develop and see how things are. So that's like one practical examples where I think that has helped them to be able to reshape that, and everybody feel heard and feel valued and feel that what they bring is important, and then they've then been able to take that, and they can then go, because they had the skills to resolve. They just unfortunately get into that intense zone where the emotions override their reasoning. But once they now recognize that themselves, like, oh, this is what we're doing, okay, we need to recognize that and say, no, please listen to me. Then they go and suddenly they're actually resolving their issues. They don't really need you anymore because you've kind of just helped them to make that cognitive connection, and then they can take that and then use that in a much more practical, and oftentimes that's all you're doing. You're bringing a bit of expertise to help unlock certain stuckness and certain things that may be difficult, and then they are the experts in their own situations. With that, they can go and do all they need to do in a much more realistic way, and oftentimes that's the way it works. Of course, there are different types of counseling and different things, but that's in general principle, that's what you're trying to do, just helping to facilitate and help people to actually continue to do what they're able to do anyway.
Thank you. Wonderful. Like the example you shared in terms of getting a couple to learn learn to be more attentive. You use the word active listening, and allowing the spouse or each of them to speak. So at least I think in that example, the woman was able to vent because she's been keeping it all in. So she's able to get it out of her system, and you making sure that they both listen to one another. I think both perspectives were heard. And in a sense, I think it helped to open up the blind spots. So both of them now become aware of what they're doing, that it's not enhancing their relationship. You use the word, the emotions override their reasoning. And I think they get to see it, and in a sense, it's kind of makes them look silly. Not saying that's what you said, but also helpful to help them toe the line of not repeating it. So thank you for sharing that example, and I think also reflective for me as well. It's been helpful to hone in more on the active listening, trying to give the other party an opportunity to express themselves. But more importantly, the reason we're having this conversation and you sharing this story is when that awareness is not there and one party seems to constantly be overriding the other. So the beauty about the example also is their willingness to want to resolve. So that goes further to say that when we explore, when we seek professional help, there are positive outcomes and our relationships get enhanced. And I think another added beauty that you put to it, they don't have to come back to you anymore. After 2, 3, whatever sessions, they have what it takes. They have they resolve and they move forward. So thank you for sharing. So finally, I think we've come to the end of today's conversation. And for me, it's just been so very enlightening. And I'm just thinking on a final note, before we close, what other full advice, if there's anything that we missed during our conversations that maybe you might want to share with our women on our podcast for today?
I think it's important to just understand that, I think if there's one thing we've learned from COVID is that, we're not just meant to do life on our own, but actually living life in significant and important clusters and having relationships that are meaningful and deep and wholesome. It's so enriching, and so giving attention to building and developing that, and like I said again when I was talking about even before relocating, being aware of the important things you have. A lot of things we need to develop, not when we're in crisis, because when we're in crisis is really hard. But when we're not in crisis, things we're working on meaningful relationships, working on, mentors and support system and all of these things. It's not because we're expecting things to go wrong, and hopefully they won't. But the good thing is when you've developed all of these things is that though when things go wrong or if things are a bit challenging, you already have resources you can call upon. And you already have a mindset that you've developed and shared a mindset and an understanding and a cognitive cohesion amongst yourselves that then enables you to take some of these tools and use them to be able to help you go forward. So that whole self-development and paying attention to what's important is really, really important. And it's not as foreign and alien, speaking particularly to my African brethren. It's not as foreign and alien as we think. We just do it in such an informal way, but there is a real wisdom in that. And let's leverage on that wisdom, whether we're using it in an informal setting or we're using it in professional setting. But that wisdom is to guide and to help us. And we're not just receiving it, we're giving it as well, and we're willing to share that wisdom and expertise that we enjoy with one another and they're there for one another. So oftentimes a lot of challenges are not that complex and complicated. It's just about being open and willing to work with one another. Of course, with the very complex and serious ones, then of course, we don't want to mess around and we send them to the right one. But majority of the time, just in that sense of empathy and openness and willingness to work with one another can make a huge difference to really helping us and de-escalating situations before it gets too bad. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Very insightful, very pragmatic also in terms of the stories, the examples you've shared, and just providing so much context. That's been really helpful. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Taiwo. It's been a pleasure having you on our podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been really lovely being able to speak to you about these issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So there, women, relocating with your spouse is a shared adventure, but it's also very crucial to maintain your individuality and sense of purpose. So whether you relocate as a couple or on single status, please keep in mind that you will need to embrace change to live outside your comfort zone as an opportunity for growth. For married couples, open communication is key, like we've learned today. So it's important to honestly discuss your expectations and shared goals in a mutually beneficial way with your spouse. You will also need to build a support network. We've also learned that today on our podcast where, we explore personal development opportunities and we prioritize self-care. And having some financial independence, even in small steps, fosters confidence and resilience. So remember, thriving in a foreign country is not just about adapting to a new place. It's about finding your strength while nurturing the bond that brought you there with your spouse or with your partner. And we don't have to get it all figured out at once. We can do this together, one step at a time. Thank you for listening to the Help We Need podcast. Stay tuned in for more episodes on living your best lives. And until next time, stay empowered and remember to empower